Hello and welcome to the Car Care Note Reviews channel, and welcome to the 2024 Volvo S90 T8 all-wheel drive Recharge. Very long name for a very long car, which in today's video we're going to do a proper technical review under the hood. We'll look under the car, we'll look at the outside, the inside, some things we like, some things we do not like, right after this. Let's start our technical review under the hood. And bear with me because there is a lot to cover here. We're going to do it as best as possible. This is the T8 system. Before we dive into each component and what it does and how it's made, let's talk about the T8 system in general. They call it the twin engine system. No, it does not have two engines. It has one gasoline engine, a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. Then it has an electric motor that drives the rear wheels, but they're actually not connected. And that's the cool thing. That's the twin engine part. So the front wheels are driven by the engine, connected to a transmission. Nothing special here. But between the engine and the transmission, you have an electric motor. That electric motor starts the engine, charges the battery when the engine is running, because then it starts spinning it, and then in high demand of power you can actually boost the engine with this little motor. Now this motor is not powerful at all, but it does help. But then in the rear there's a whole different motor and differential that drives only the rear wheels, and they're not connected. So this car being all-wheel drive, it does not have a transfer case and a prop shaft. It goes all the way to it doesn't have all that. And we'll take a look at it a little bit when we look underneath the car. That is the basic premise of this system. Now this car, if I would translate it from Volvo language to English, it's a plug-in hybrid. Not a very good one, as you'll find out in this video. Let's dive into powertrain and we'll talk about how things work. So this engine is the B4204 T57. I don't know why they need this long of a name. It could have been just T57 or B57, but that's what Volvo does. Let's dive into it. Very old school engine. There's a lot of things here that just don't exist in other cars anymore, but in Volvo. First thing is, let's start with the mechanical construction. This does not have a plastic valve cover because this comes from a very different era. However, there are some things. First thing is, the valve cover is actually the cam caps as well. So usually in engines, you take the valve cover off and then the cam caps are there holding down the cams. Well, this one, you take the valve cover, they actually also are the cam caps. So just the cams will just be flying around. Not the best design in the world. They do that to make it compact, but it's just a 4-cylinder engine. Doesn't need to really be compact. Single piece cylinder head, of course, because half the cylinder head technically is in the valve cover. The injectors, the direct injector, this is of course a direct injected engine only. They do sit on the valve cover, which makes removing it even a 3 times worse job, because now you have to worry about the cams, and then the injectors have to come out, and that's the complication of this. Now this engine actually has dual variable valve timing, but the way they do this is very interesting. So this does not have hydraulic lifters. This actually have tappets or buckets for valve adjustments. You just change the height of the bucket and that changes the valve clearance. So this does not have hydraulic lifters, which is very interesting. But what is even more interesting is this engine does not have a timing chain. It's a timing belt engine. This is something that has basically become almost obsolete in the automotive industry because belts require a lot of cost and maintenance to change them, and the maintenance, and then you're limited by the belts flex and all that with these high-tech variable valve timings. Well, this one has a timing belt, but that timing belt does not drive a water pump because this doesn't have a mechanical water pump. Remember, it's plug-in hybrid. So it has the electric water pump in a very Volvo-like location, right in the front, in almost between the engine and the transmission. It's just where they deem the water pump needs to go. And then the AC compressor is electric, so this car doesn't have a belt. But you might be asking, wait, so this doesn't have an alternator? No, because the motor between the engine and the transmission is what starts the engine. So you don't have a drive belt here, which is pretty cool. Now there are a few extremely interesting things about this engine. Because it is extremely old, and because emission standards don't wait for Volvo to update their stuff, this is lagging behind. So in order to do that, this has one of the world's most complicated catalytic converters. It is so complicated that halfway through the 25-page article about it, I stopped and we deduced that it is extremely complicated, and I don't even want to ask how expensive it is. But because of that, this has 3 air-fuel ratio sensors, not the regular one, just to really precisely be able to control the air-fuel ratio. So this would qualify for the emissions rating that it has, being a plug-in hybrid. Now, we talked briefly about the fuel system. It is direct injection only. Injectors sit at the top. That's unfortunately, with carbon buildup, may be an issue in the future. Now, this engine is turbocharged, so you do have a turbo in the back, and it is vacuum controlled for the wastegate, which is pretty cool. That's the good way you want it for reliability. And then has an air-to-air intercooler all the way in the front, pipes running all the way to the front and back, and all that. That's how again, folks, what I want you to take from this is this engine is pretty old. It's been around for a long time, and they just don't update this whole system. But here's where things get a little bit more complicated. The cooling systems, because there's multiple systems in this. The first one is for the engine and the cabin heating. And then you do have some of that going to the turbo to cool it. You don't have a liquid-to-air intercooler, so that's all this does. They do have a few multiple way valves to change the flow of coolant when the engine is off and whatnot, because this HVAC system can run-ish without the engine, because this is a plug-in hybrid. But then here is the interesting part. What happens when your engine is off, it's very cold outside, and you need to heat the cabin? Well, in every other manufacturer that has a plug-in hybrid, not an electric car, because this is not an electric car, they will simply either force the engine on or have a heavy-duty heat pump system that heats up the cabin, and we don't need to force the engine on. They will only force the engine on when it's extremely cold, where the heat pump system can't keep up. Not in this, though. This has a coolant heater, and not the good kind of coolant heater. Therefore, it takes forever to warm up the cabin in really cold weather when you're only running in electric mode. In that mode, they call it pure. You can change the drive mode inside. Now, the second cooling system is for the battery. Now, lithium-ion batteries are very interesting. You have to keep them at a specific temperature. Otherwise, they're not happy. Too cold is not good. Too hot is not good. It needs to be an optimal operating temperature. So what they did here is you have a separate coolant circuit with a separate water pump, separate radiator, separate everything, only for the battery. When the battery gets too hot, that coolant goes, cools it, and we're good. But when the coolant's too cold and you need to heat up that battery, an electric heater will come on to heat up the coolant, which then will warm up the battery, and we're good. But if things get hot, you're going to send that coolant to cool the battery. But if things get way too hot, they have a heat exchanger that takes that coolant into this heat exchanger, uses AC refrigerant to cool that coolant, extra cool that coolant, which now goes and cools the battery. This is actually, sounds extremely complicated. It's actually pretty simple in plug-in hybrid world because you don't have a heat pump system. And I think this is one of the things the system lacks. They do need to do better in their HVAC performance, especially in really cold weather. Now, component-wise, you only have a little control unit here that does all the magic for the front. And then the back unit also has its own inverter, if you would, and it does have some of the coolant for the battery also going there to cool it and come back. Then the transmission. And here is a surprise. So this whole system actually has an 8-speed transmission. It's a regular, good old 8-speed transmission, sourced from Aisin, and that is a Japanese company. And this is a transmission you will find in many, many Toyota and Lexus models and others. It's just an 8-speed transmission from Toyota. I hope this is the good variant of that, because there were some issues with this transmission when it first came out, but then things got smooth. So you basically have a Toyota transmission. How bad can it be? Very familiar transmission. Actually, it's very simple. It's just a good old 8-speed transmission with no complications whatsoever. And that is the interesting thing about the T8 system. See, in the front, you have the engine, you have the transmission, everything's normal. In the rear, electric motor drives the rear only. And the best way to describe this powertrain is this. It's very old, high maintenance, because you have a timing belt and you have some complications with maintenance. But the biggest problem is, this is kind of a historical problem with Volvo. Maintenance on these engines, on these cars, they require a lot of special tools, and there will be not another car that has the technology and the way they do things in Volvos. So service is a concern with Volvos, always. You can't just show up to any gas station, any mechanic, and tell them, hey, can you just do this repair real quick? They'll just look at the car and be like, I'd like to sleep good at night. I don't want to deal with this headache. That is the problem. It is not a headache. It's not like something is badly designed, but it's designed the Volvo way. And the problem with these cars is that's something to be considering. If you're regularly living in rural areas, this will start to get in the way. But one thing have to be said, in addition to that, looking around here as a mechanic, I don't see things cheaply made. And that is one thing Volvo does well underneath here. Things are not cheap. They don't use a plastic valve cover. They don't use cheapo plastic that just feels like it wants to break. They use good quality stuff. And that is a point towards them. The complication, and there are separate ways of doing things, that does take from it a little bit. But overall, things are not flimsy and cheaply made, and that is a good thing. And lastly, in the technical department here, before we take a look underneath it, how does the system drive? So we've driven the XC90, and that was very laggy. It was a similar system. It was very laggy. This one, I felt like they did some improvements in the 24, perhaps to the programming, because everything else is the same. It just feels more responsive. And the biggest thing with this system, it's very powerful. And in that department, in the acceleration department, it will shock you. I mean, it's a 4-cylinder engine, turbocharged. The combined power of this system is very impressive. And that is one of its really good things. Just don't drive in really cold weather, because things will get really cold. And last advice. All right, we said this was the last thing, but one last thing. If you are a short mechanic like myself, yeah, it's nice, but it's not nice. Let's take a look underneath the Volvo S90. Of course, everything is covered up. It does have a pretty flat underbelly. We'll talk about a few interesting things. Everything's covered up here. You know, if you want to get your engine maintenance, whatnot, covers have to come off. But let's take a look at the front suspension with some interesting things. Everything's aluminum, and that's including the backing plate. Knuckle is aluminum, the bracket for the lower ball joint, which I like this lower ball joint because you notice that it's 2 balls and bolt one nut to the top, and the ball joint separates, so that's good for service. It does have this very interesting contraption for the strut mount right here, and then there's another upper control arm, which is all aluminum. Everything is aluminum here, which is interesting. Something interesting about Volvo, as a mechanic, honestly, I will admit, I have not worked on a lot of Volvos in my life, and that is a good thing. If you're a mechanic, you know what I mean. There's something very interesting about Volvo that they do here for their axles. They use a single bolt that is 13 millimeter, and it actually looks like a very small bolt. To hold their axle into the knuckle, every other company uses something massive or a giant nut. This one, just a tiny little 13 millimeter bolt. Don't know how they pulled it like that, but they do, in case you didn't know that. Interesting thing for such a big car, single piston caliper. It is a pretty big pad, but it is a single piston caliper. That was kind of a surprise to see that. There's a lot of aluminum here, and all of that will, anything steel on this aluminum stuff in the future will cease, unfortunately, for dissimilar metals, but that's how they are. Now, there's one cue. We talked about the transmission a little bit. If you look right here, right here at that plug. If you own a Lexus, certain years Lexus, right around 2016, 17, that is exact same plug because that is exact same transmission. So here is that. Exhaust is very interesting here. First, I don't like these hangers. This is the cheapest hanger possible, and I like how this one is fully extended. Like you see how this is open, and then this one is all the way pushed up. So that means this bracket is not really. Usually Volvo has better exhaust. This one is not one of those. This muffler, though, or resonator, is very interesting, very small, skinny. They did that intentionally so they can make the bottom flat. And that, I suppose, is nice, but the coverings don't go all the way to the edge. And we're going to talk about the interior in a bit. This is a pretty quiet car. It's interesting that this is just wide open, but I do like the finishing. There's nothing really that stands out. Now, on top of the exhaust is when you normally see your drive shaft and all that for the rear, because this is all-wheel drive. This is actually where the battery lives. And that's what the whole thing with the T8 system was. We're gonna put the battery here, so you have this giant transmission tunnel, but you would not have anything else different about the car, and you don't have a drive shaft, which leads us to this massive electric transmission, as they call it. So this is basically an electric motor. This is what makes the twin engine. This is the second engine, according to Volvo. The first one is the gasoline one, and this is the second one. So this is an electric motor that only drives the rear wheels. That's what makes this a very interesting car, because the front's being driven by the transmission, the rear is purely electric. So when you go into pure mode or electric only this will drive the car. So technically it becomes a rear-wheel drive car, which is pretty interesting, to say the least. Let's look at the rear suspension here, because there's very few cars in the world that you will see this giant control arm on. It's just over-elaborate piece of aluminum, and that is very interesting. Even the backing plate is aluminum, and then this is steel, and there's a few more arms that are steel. Interesting setup. Volvo is one type of company that you'd say they do things the Volvo way, the Swedish way. Very interesting. Speaking of the Swedishness, many of you have commented on previous videos on Volvo reviews that they're actually owned by a Chinese company. There's nothing wrong with that, but they're no longer a fully owned Swedish company. Here's a small interesting observation. If you look at the backing plate, a very insignificant part is made in Sweden. Very proudly, and looks beautiful. Folks, things that are made in Sweden, the Swedish have their own way. They usually do things very well. I mean, it is beautiful backing plate. It is aluminum, and it is just to me, things like that. I mean, this could have been a cheap material. It wouldn't have mattered, but it does because it's made in Sweden. Then we look at the control arm. It is made in Italy. It says it right here. Made in Italy, and it's just very beautiful designs. The Italians put passion in everything they design. It have to be beautiful, and it is. And then we look at the main component. This says made in China. So this has nothing to do with Volvo being owned by a Chinese company. Actually, this is how the automotive industry is, especially smaller companies. I mean, you say Volvo is a small company, it's kind of incorrect, but Volvo Cars is a small company. And this is what they do. They take this from a supplier in Italy, this from a supplier in China. They make their own backing plates and things go. So that's how it is with this car and many other manufacturers. It was just interesting that in a very small part, you have many corners of the planet. Then we go in the very back, we look at this. So this car has air suspension, but not really. It's only the rear that has air suspension. Usually this is reserved for like trucks where you're gonna put stuff in the back or tow a boat and you want it to come up. But in a car like this, it's kind of interesting to see that. So we do have air suspension only in the rear, but we do have adaptive suspension. You can see the little actuator on the shock here on all four corners, and that is pretty interesting. And lastly, the brakes on the Volvo are a little bit, rear brakes, a little bit difficult to see, but they are single piston caliper. You do have an electronic parking brake motor on it, and that's pretty much the standard of the automotive industry, although Volvo does not follow the automotive industry. We look here, they do follow a little bit. You notice here we have a component, but the rest is wide open. But this space here is completely open. This is becoming the fashion these days. And this little speaker is what makes a very interesting sound when you put it in reverse and the engine is off, just to alert people, kind of a proximity alert deal. And then of course, like I told you, Volvo, they do their own thing. We have this very large opening. Now, if this was on a truck, I would assume it is maybe for a trailer hitch or something, but this is a sedan, and if you notice, this is not exactly centered. So I wonder what were they planning to do here, and their mother company said no, because the Swedish will do that. They'll just keep going at something until they are absolutely fascinated by it, and you end up with things like this. Very interesting to look underneath this car. Let's take a look at the outside of the S90. The first thing have to be said, just look at it. It's a beautiful, elegant looking thing in the front. It does not follow any trend or any fashion of the automotive industry. It just looks very elegant. It's not flashy. It is not, it doesn't give you that, wow, this is like something just makes your eyes open. It just soothes you with its elegance. That's the way I see it. It just looks beautiful. Iconic Volvo logo and grille, just very subtle, nothing really over the top, and that's what makes it elegant. The headlights, they don't have 17 reflectors and all that. They just have one beam in the middle and one this way, and that's it. They're very simple, but yet very elegant. I really like how this car looks in the front. It just has a very elegant look because it's not over the top. Now, radar sensor is right here, and interestingly, the 360 camera is integrated in it. It just looks very seamless, and I really like that integration. Now, the hood has one feature that is very interesting. So you see this body line that comes here, and then it wraps up here, but part of it goes into that front nose. This gives it a very interesting profile. I really like the front of this car, and the little details when you start looking at them. Like, look at this, how they rolled this fender into the front. It just has the fender has a very interesting shape. Very nice car, and the fender has a flat surface here. That's what gives it, I think, because the side profile of this car is also very simple, at least in the front. Very simple, but very elegant. You see, there's no over-the-top body lines, and that's what makes it really nice. Now, we do have, this is the Recharge model. You see Recharge written right here. So we do have the plug to charge it up. Here's my small issue with the plug. It's very sturdy door, which I like, but there's no cap. The reason for that is they put a rubber seal here and this here, so when you close it, hopefully, it will seal it from the elements. I would much rather have a cap. Something that is, integrated there. That would have been nicer for the real world, but they did not deem that necessary. Then something about Volvos. We've been reviewing a few Volvos now. They have this clip on the windshield. It's just right here. Because only Volvo thinks that you need a place to put your parking ticket. Just, the parking little slip when you're in city, you can put it here, and you have a place to hold it. Because putting it on top of the dash is unacceptable. Moving on to the side. I really like how this side looks like. Of course, this is a luxury car at this price point. I would hope this is standard. You can lock the front and the rear doors from the handle, which is pretty nice. The wheels are a very interesting shape. So they're trying to go with more like the Aero wheels, because this is a plug-in hybrid. Very interesting looking wheel. Some will like it, some will dislike it. I think it's just okay. But then we arrive at the rear of the Volvo where things, to a point, fall off, at least in my opinion. I don't think this matches the elegance of the front. I think the front looks really nice, and this just, for lack of a better word, it doesn't. And it's it has a lot going on. I mean, the taillights kind of, they don't match the overall image of the car. But then I don't know what happened here. Why do we need, just watch how many curves this trunk has. There's this, and then there's a dip. And then it goes up again, and then it dips. And then it goes up again and dips a little bit. And then it curves out, and then it comes down. There's way too much going on in the trunk. And this is where more is less. All this is just to write Volvo. If this was flat down, it would have made it a lot simpler to make, and you could have still put Volvo. Volvo did not have to be facing up a little bit so you can see it. Would have been fine also. It's just, I don't really like the rear of this car. And then here is the small thing. Let's read out the name of the car, since we are here. Volvo S90 T8 all-wheel drive Recharge. I don't think we need to have this many badging on the outside just to identify the car. I think if we would have just put Volvo S90, maybe just write T8 here. I think everybody should know what a T8 is if you're going into the Volvo world. They did, and that's okay. Let's look at the trunk, which interestingly has the opening right here in one of these cuts. Power trunk, which is actually a pretty rapid power trunk. We've seen some cars are really slow. The trunk is deep but not wide. There's a lot of real estate here, which makes the trunk narrow. You can't really put wide stuff, you'd have to go in. But what makes up for that, it's a little on the deeper side, which is nice. You do have a charge cable right here. And then you can open this to expose some sheet metal. I'm surprised how quiet this car is and how low level of insulation that it has. I mean, this is just sheet metal. There's no insulation whatsoever. And of course, you don't have a spare tire here, and you have the inflate kit and all that, and that's kind of the way new cars are going. But pretty interesting, to say the least. You do have one to close the trunk, one to close and lock the door, which is, I suppose, is nice. I like how rapid it is. We've seen some cars that really take their time when they're closing, and that's how they did it. Now, the brake light is enormous. Again, that's just the Volvo way. And interestingly, the brake light has a speaker on top of it, just to make it more kind of dual purpose. And that is the S90 on the outside. Let's take a look at the inside of the Volvo S90. And there's something to be said about this interior. Your initial impression of it when you sit down, it is such a nice place to be in. The truth have to be said. The seats are extremely comfortable. The material of this leather on the seats, I don't know what's wrong with luxury car manufacturers. Why don't they use exactly this? Because this is very, very nice. Now, this nice leather does not come here or on the dash, and that's understandable, at least, but I think here it should have been. But the fit and finish and materials here overall, they really did that part well. However, this interior is not perfect. It does have a lot of issues, and these issues have nothing to do with the S90. This is just Volvo overall. They don't update their things, and they really need to. For example, this initially nice screen that is, you know, it looks like a tablet and whatnot. It is, for lack of a better word, feels like a very cheap Android tablet. Doesn't have wireless Apple CarPlay. It takes you a seriously long time to get used to how the layout is. And then when you do, the icons and everything, it just doesn't match how nice this interior is. And then we move to the gauges, the giant screen. Well, this screen does absolutely nothing. You can display the map, or you can make the map go away. And if you want to see your odometer, you actually have to press a button to show the odometer, and then it disappears. They really need to work on this tech here, because we've reviewed a lot of cars, and you will get into some really economy cars will have a lot better infotainment system than this very expensive luxury car. And then the shifter is this beautiful crystal. I think this is one of the nicest things about this interior. It just looks so elegant, so special. Not many manufacturers do stuff like this anymore, and here it is. It's just a gorgeous shifter. And then we have the start button, just conveniently located where you never think it is. until you've driven this car for a few months and gotten used to it. Because as soon as you get into this car, you immediately start reaching here. Oh, I drive a Volvo. It's right here. Just that's how they do things. There's not a lot of buttons and things. All your HVAC controls are on the screen. The only thing you have is this big volume knob, and then play, pause, skip, and defrost back in front, and hazard switch. But here's something very, very interesting about this button situation. So we reviewed an XC90, and that one had a button to open the glove box. Well, this one, you can just open the glove box with a little manual release, which is nice. But the button is still there. And here's what happens when you press that button. That is not a very nice sound. The fit and finish overall is good, but certain things, especially in this area, it's a little on the creaky side for a car this expensive. But I guess the biggest concern is, we go back to the T8 system. Remember how when we looked underneath it, we said the battery was in the transmission tunnel. But that was actually not 100% the story, because the transmission tunnel in this is extremely high. I mean, it's unbelievable how high the transmission tunnel in this. We've reviewed a lot of cars. This is one of the highest one. And the side effect of that is you basically have no center console. You can place very little in the center console because the transmission tunnel is so high that they couldn't really make it into a deep center console. So it's basically useless. You can put a few business cards and whatnot, and that's about it. The other thing is the sunroof. This has a big panoramic sunroof, which is really nice. I don't know why we need this sliding deal to operate it. Very confusing. It'll take you a long time to get used to it, but that's the Volvo way. Everything is just unique and different. Not always unique in a good way, but certain things are. Most of them are not, honestly, especially with this car that needs a lot of updating. The wood here, though, and the sound system. Once you get past the cheap Android tablet here, the sound system that this car have is very nice. It is something very impressive. The more cars we review, the more I notice that newer cars have really not good sound systems. This one is a true standout. And what's more of a standout on this is how quiet this car is. You turn off this beautiful radio, which I don't recommend you do because it's really isn't good sounding, but you get past the technology and you're not into that. This is a very quiet and refined ride. I mean, the suspension is tuned in a way, it's not tuned for sport or anything, although it's not exactly a boat. It does handle decent for what it is. But it's so insulated, it gives you that cloud feel. And a lot of newer cars or luxury cars, they don't have that anymore. They just have firm and just sporty suspension. This has just cloud suspension without being super floaty, and that's a nice thing. And I guess to sum it up, if you're a person into technology, this may not be the car for you. But if you're a person that is after a comfortable, quiet place, this is really good for that, because the seats are very comfortable. The materials are very nice, and it's very well insulated, and that is something, to me, they did really well, that part. Let's take a look at the back seat of the Volvo S90. And I am 5'7". This is my driving position. I mean, this is a huge back seat. Initially, when you look at this car from outside, it does look long, but it doesn't look like, you know, a long wheelbase, super comfortable car in the back. But this is an enormous amount of space. This is a very comfortable place to be. Now, there are a few things here that are interesting. You do have a screen here where you can control the rear climate zones. They are cooled and heated seats, which is pretty cool. Now, you do have a little console here with a wooden accent on it. So you can sit down here comfortably. You do have some stuff here. You do have a very small storage, kind of like the front one. The transmission tunnel, though, or we call it transmission, there's actually nothing here transmission, but the tunnel is very large and you can see it. You do have a HVAC vent here, which is nice, but what is more nice is this. Power shades. That is pretty cool. You have one in the back, of course, on that side as well. But now this car was actually meant to be a chauffeur-driven car. So on the passenger side, when you sit, you can actually control the passenger front seat in a way that only Volvo would do. On the door itself, there's a control for this seat to push it forward and everything. You can control the sunroof, you can control the sunroof shade, and the rear shade, the side shades. That is pretty cool. So you can basically sit here and operate everything, but not from the console here, from the door itself, which is the Volvo way. Let's talk about some things I do not like about the Volvo S90, and specifically the Recharge one. The performance of the T8 system in very cold weather, like we're talking extreme cold weather, which the time we've had this car, we've had some really cold weather here in Chicago area, it was not good. It took forever to warm up, and then if you put it in pure mode, you basically had no heat for an extended period of time, something unreal. I can't believe a 2024 car made by a Swedish company, which Sweden is a very cold country, can have this bad performance in cold weather. It was just shocking. That's the truth, folks. T8 system is really old and really needs a serious update, especially if you live in cold weather. This will be a huge problem. And the second thing, once you get past the cold weather performance of the HVAC system, is the tech. This is a very nice car. The interiors, there are a lot of material things, there are old school things that are done well, but the infotainment system it has a steep learning curve, and once you finally figure out how everything works, you realize it's really outdated. It basically feels like a cheap Android tablet. I'm sorry, Volvo, but that's the way everybody sees it. It just doesn't work well. It's very complicated for the sake of just complicated. It looks like nobody cared to make it a little bit more streamlined. And it takes a really long time for you to get used to how everything works. And then the tech overall, like the gauges, you only can display the map. You can't even see your odometer. You have to press an additional button just to see the odometer. I think that needs updating. Unfortunately, this car, while it has a lot of nice things, it really needs a serious update to the tech, to the powertrain, and if at that point, at this price point, you have a lot of competitors that are seriously good at everything that this car does. So why the compromise, we ask? That's the biggest problem with this car, I think. So should you buy a Volvo S90? Folks, this one is a tough one, and let me elaborate here. This car is a very elegant looking car. The wow factor of this car, not because it's flashy whatnot, but from how elegant it is. It's very high, the initial one. You look at the front, it looks very beautiful. It's not a trendy car, it is a classic Volvo. You get inside, it's very welcoming, very comfortable, and just the materials and the fit finish and the feel of the car is just something unique. But the problem is when the first and second hour elapse and now you're spending more time in this car and you start seeing its flaws. And that's the problem. This T8 system is probably the biggest problem with this car. When this T8 system came out, it was great. It was actually something unique. But now it's outdated, and its performance in cold weather is, for lack of a better word, not good at all. That's one of the biggest problems. The second thing is the price of this car. I mean, at this price, you are in territory of some serious cars. Perhaps not this particular size, or at least not this optioned. But the infotainment system, the complete lack of a center console, the gauge that absolutely does one or two things, nothing else, and then the complete feeling of outdatedness on anything tech. It does make that up with very nice leather seats, very comfortable seats, and just overall refinement on the old school refinement. Quiet, good fit and finish, good materials, but we're in 2024 and buyers today, they're starting not to appreciate these things. They want tech, and tech, this car is really behind. And that's the biggest problem with this car. Long-term reliability is a giant question mark, because this car's problem, aside from reliability, is finding somebody to work on it. That's the biggest problem. You take any car to any mechanic in the middle of nowhere and you had an issue on a trip. You show up they'll figure it out for you and you'll be on your way. You show up in a Volvo though, they may not even look at it. That's becoming a problem because Volvo does things the Volvo way, and that equals a lot of special tools and a lot of special things and a lot of specific training. That's why Volvo specialists usually, they're always busy, because not everybody wants to work in a Volvo, and that is a thing against this reliability factor actually, because you cannot easily service this other than the dealer and very specialists. So overall, this is a very nice, comfortable car, and it could be done really better if they update the T8 system, move away from it, or at least update the inside, because the tech in this car is really outdated and it's just doesn't match the rest of this car. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you. And you have yourself a wonderful day.